focus on vulnerable children. Those, I know all children are vulnerable, but we know that there are special groups which are more vulnerable because of maybe their disabilities, or because they don't have access to the support groups like their families, their neighborhoods, schools, and so on. I have two very enlightened as well as active people who work in the field over here, and I'm sure they're going to give us a lot of information as well as share their experiences from which we can learn. We have Bernie D'Souza. She is the founder member of Jan Gahi, a very well-known NGO which is working in South Goa on the rights of women and children. And they also work on the prevention, protection and prosecution, especially child sexual abuse, as well as other community-based issues. Bernie will be talking about her own experiences and sharing some case examples to bring out the issues and responses of the custodians of the law. Some discussion has happened in the previous session about this, and in particular she'll be focusing on the police, the Child Welfare Committee, and the other officials in the field of child labor, as well as talk about children who work on and live on the streets. Bernie, start.
I will start immediately with the cases. The first case that I am taking up is the case of 3 boys who were apprehended under the JJ Act for theft. This was a few years back. The boys in conflict with law were detained at night at the police station, and instead of being transferred immediately to Apnagar. At night, 2 policemen indulged in voyeurism by getting 2 of the boys to molest each other. The boys in Apnagar revealed it to the NGO social worker. In those days, this is something that we must know. In those days, one of the good practices was that NGOs were permitted to conduct activities in Apnagar in a child-friendly atmosphere prevalent in the home. The rights and responsibilities of children were discussed with them. In this context, these children brought up the violation of their rights and vulnerabilities. A positive outcome of this kind of an atmosphere created by the positive response of the state was that children could diffuse their tensions and anger and had a voice. Coming back to the case, which became public through the press, the result was the suspension of the police. This case and other cases thereafter led to the state closing the gates of Apnagar to NGOs, who were rights-based. The outcome during the last few years is well known, where the children have created havoc from time to time. The Levinson Martin's report has brought out some of these aspects. Another case is that of a street girl, 12 years old, beautiful looking, living with her sister who was 18 years old. Her sister was involved with a truck driver from whom she had a child. This outstation truck driver, a married man, used to come to deliver goods with 2 other young men, cleaners' assistants. And they would spend the night in the truck near the house where these girls lived. The younger girl, being at risk, was through the CWC transferred to Apnagar by us. However, within a short time, when the sister came to meet her, she was released to her. We requested that she be kept there for some more time, suggesting that some rehab with training plan be made for her, but this did not happen. We ourselves were simultaneously trying for her rehabilitation. Now, this girl, after nearly 8 years, had 1 marriage and 2 live-ins with 2 children and has not settled down. She has been in and out of the streets, and it is our contention that if the responses then consider the protection and development of the child, she would not continue on the streets being sexually exploited through the relationships, and had a skill to make a decent living. In the third case that came to us in August 2012 was of a 17-year-old boy who was seen sniffing. He was rescued with the help of control room van by calling 100. He was taken to the Women and Child Police Unit, and the process of documentation to produce him before the CWC was to begin by the police. And the child disappeared under the nose of two lady constables who excused themselves with the justification that the child followed our team member when she went out of the unit. Often the attitude of the police to such children and cases is that they are of a nuisance value. The police hardly engage in conversation with the children, which would show their interest and perhaps even win the confidence of the child. They think that the NGOs have rescued the child, now it is their responsibility to see that the child is in a safe place. The child gave us a vague address, and it was our initiative that we followed up on the child. We found the mother drunk and having no home. She informed us that the child has not been seen for long. And 2 months later, the child was again seen sniffing with a group of street boys, again rescued, produced before the CWC, and the CWC would call us to make statements. The CWC had earlier made a statement, as reported in the newspaper some times back, that NGOs are dumping children in Apnagar. Probably perceiving our placement of the child as dumping, the CWC handed over the child to the mother. No home study was done, or if it was done, it was incorrect, as the child had no home to go to and a mother who was incapacitated. We were not called for a statement, wherein after understanding the situation of the child, we make recommendations in our statement. The child is back on the streets, we meet him. He is unsafe and addicted to the substance. What should have been an appropriate state response to such street children? Shouldn't considerations of an action plan for restoring and reinstating such children as per the JJ Act be part of a more concerned and constructive response? The fourth case is of a child who was working with a family, probably since the age of 8. When the case came to us months back, we understood that the child was 12 years then. The girl was reportedly living with the family for protection, as there was a case of rape in the area of her parental residence. She was removed from the school for so-called protection from rape. Incidentally, the parents of the child were working for a family member of the family with whom the child was residing now. They denied that she worked for them, even though people have seen her to be working. Was this story of the protection of the child to be believed? If so, why was the child not sent to school to continue her studies? When the case came up and the child was interrogated, she spoke in English. That the child could speak in English and is confident should be a point to note. That if this child was given the opportunity to study, she would have excelled. Whereas this fact is used to continue the exploitation of the child. No consideration was given to the fact of the trampling of the basic and primary rights to childhood that had hampered her development and her future economic prospects. It was mentioned that she was merely giving company to an old person. Is it the right of this child to give company to an old person, and that too a person who is unrelated by blood. There was no consideration even at this stage when the girl was being returned to her family, when some plan could have been made for having some of her rights realized, like the right to development with some skill training for a livelihood, for instance. The CWC could have also called for a home study and inquiry before release of the child, as is the practice to be followed. There should have been an investigation and inquiry conducted into the fact that the child was employed for 6 years when she was below 14 years of age, and the fact that residing with a person unrelated by blood is a crime and violation of the Goa Children's Act, and that for a child to reside with anyone unrelated by blood, there has to be prior written permission. For this, section 8(4) of the Goa Children's Act can be referred to. This section needed to be inquired into seriously, as it was circumvented to employ the child. The Goa Children's Act was formulated and fine-tuned, taking into consideration these facts which are serious in nature, enabling exploitation of children. Another case is that of a 7-year-old boy who was brought by his mother to Apnaghar for protection. It so happened that on that day, violence broke out at Apnaghar and the mother witnessed it. She soon after came to release the child. The child returned back to the mother and to the streets again and was picked up again by the police and placed in Apnaghar. The child was again released to the mother while we were making attempts to counsel the mother, help her to understand safety issues and transferring him to another home. And we would have got her cooperation slowly, but in the meantime, the child was already released to the mother. Again, a third time, the child was found on the street and rescued again and again released to the mother. And the reasons cited were that the mother created a ruckus every time she visited, and this time she brought pressure of press persons. In this case, we also got a call from the office of an MLA to put pressure and threaten us. One wonders how such a poor, vulnerable woman managed to get this support. What are the motives behind the scenes of such concern? And a proper response to this, a proper response would be the procedure should have been a home study to ensure that the family is fit for the care and protection of the child, and if not, a fit institution or fit person or foster care should have been the next best alternative, while counseling the mother on the hazards of abuse of the child on the street. In 3 other cases of child labor, we also received calls from MLA's offices. And since they did not have their way with us, as we did not yield to their pressures and threats, they managed to control the proceedings with the police and no FIR was filed. These were cases of child labor. The cases then were sent to the Sessions Court instead of the Children's Court for closure. In the first case that came to us for closure, it was one of an 8-year-old girl who was working in a household and locked out on the veranda with no food and water when the employer went out for the whole day. After several hearings, the case was returned back to the police for further investigation. And a year has passed and we have been running from police station to the court for a copy of the order. The police claim they have not received the file, while as the court documents show clearly that the file has been sent. We are at a loss to state what should have been the response. but one can understand how political pressures move in support of the accused and the police deploy delay tactics to frustrate us. Recently, we have come across cases of children going to Hubli. The parents lodge a missing complaint. No inquiry or search for the missing child is done thereafter. When the child returns, if ever the child returns, we are called to be present for the statement of the child, to be recorded, so that the police can wash their hands of any kind of blame. After that, we are left to look into the findings and seek rehab of the child, as we are concerned about a relapse, that the child will once again go missing, run away to another place. Here our response could be that the NGOs and the state systems need to work closely on issues of safety of runaway and missing children who are on the streets. And the last case that I am going to mention is a case of 6 years back, but it is worth mentioning. This was a case wherein a police showed real concern and thoughtfulness. A case of a minor girl who had not yet reached puberty. A tourist abuser was negotiating with her on the beach. The tourist police on duty felt that there was something suspicious and called Childline. Our team member met the girl, and she confided that the man had sex with her twice and he was negotiating a third time. What is important in this is that girls like these are still unsafe. The operations of the tourists have become more covered and organized nowadays. But the positive responses like this of the tourist police are required for children's safety. I'll end with this. We have responses, put it in a kind of which can be demands from the state. I think it is circulated to you all. I should, because we have some time, I don't go through it, but it is all.
Thank you, Bunny, for giving us these case examples which help us to understand the range of different situations that one has to face in the field, as well as the sometimes indifferent as well as erroneous responses of the custodians of the law. And I think we will discuss more about this after my next speaker has finished. We have Alina Gomes, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Carmel College. She's also a trained psychotherapist and a gestalt therapist. Alina will be focusing on a very less talked about and painful topic of incest in society, and the fact that it is a reality. Also the importance of addressing and including this topic when we discuss sexual abuse. She will also share with us the profile of the victim of incest and child sexual abuse.
It's a pleasure to be here and to share insights on the topic, incest, because it is not so well spoken about in our society. We think it's not a reality. We think that pedophiles are all white people or strangers in the streets, and that this does not happen. So before I'm going to break my, it's a very short presentation. My presentation is going to be divided first in defining incest and looking at it through cultural relevance. How do we see it in India, in Goa? And then I will be speaking about a case and what are the difficulties in reporting, what do victims of incest go through. So what is incest? Our book defines it as a culturally prohibited sexual relation between family members such as brothers, sisters, parents and child, uncles, aunts, cousins, etc. It also shares the domain of pedophile behaviors when the victim is a minor, that is pre-pubertal. Certain sects in our community, however, have interrelation marriages because of the need to keep the genetic pool, the kind of bloodline. In ancient world, Egyptian pharaohs would marry their sisters. So for my presentation, I would rather not get into incest relationships, but rather I would get into incest relationships which are also pedophile incest relationships. The topic requires to be looked through the sieve of cultural denial that such incest exists in our society. And before I start, I would like to make 2 points which I consider very relevant, because if we need to discuss incest, we also need to look at these 2 points. The first being that most of us treat each other as if we were non-sexual beings, and the life force, that is the sexual energy that is there in each one of us, is repressed to such an extent that it is non-accepted. So in our society, sex is unaccepted, dirty. Even if we want to discuss it, we have no safe spaces. Sex education in schools is not very well received, because the first thought that comes to the mind of the parents and some teachers as well is that we are going to spoil our children by giving them spaces to talk about sex. The second point I would like to state that in our society, elders in the family are revered, especially fathers and the male figure. We have different types of rituals which bring this out to fore. Like for example, we will not bet answer an older person or speak when an older person is talking. Or we will not, one of our significant rituals is that when there is an older person in the room, we touch the feet of the older person. So there is a power relationship between an older person, a family member, and a younger person. And these factors need to be taken into account, basically because when we look at incest, what the victim goes through, these factors play an important role. So I begin to understand the profile of victims of incest who have difficulty in expressing what they are going through and what is happening to them. If you look at statistics on child abuse in India, it's very interesting. In a study that was done in 2007, there were 2,211 respondents that were taken, of which 58% of the children reported child abuse. Okay, of this, 48% boys and 39% girls from the upper middle class and middle class reported having some kind of sexual abuse experience to them. If you look at the statistics and you take the numbers, that is almost about 1,000 people in the 2,000 population, 50%. If you look at it, if you take just 25% as a rate of abuse and with children, and you see it, then we are talking about in a population of 7 lakh women in Goa, then 1,75,000 must have experienced some kind of sexual abuse, and that's a huge number. Most of this, 50% of the cases of sexual abuse are reported as being a family member, someone close to the family, or a family acquaintance. Given this whole background, I would like to therefore introduce the victim of incest pedophile relation. These experiences happened because of some kind of discussion that happened, and the girls came out and spoke about it. But the cases came to me not as incest, because it's not spoken about, but as behavior patterns which we would look at as borderline patterns. Okay, the girl, case A, was a girl who came to me because of mood swings. She would feel very sad sometimes, very happy sometimes. She didn't know what was happening to her. There was a tendency of hers, she would report at cutting her hands, mutilating her body. Now these are symptoms of borderline personality, what we see in clinical behavior patterns. And so, and sometimes these behavior patterns have signs of child abuse. So when I started discussing with her if she had had any anger which she had within her, her story came out that her uncle would sexually molest her when she was from 6 years old. And he would make her touch him, and the behavior patterns were such that initially she was scared to report it. When she did report it to her mother rubbished her as saying that she was imagining things. So she had to keep quiet. The uncle took advantage of the situation and continued doing it till she was old enough to get out of the situation and not spend time at home. Case 2 was of another girl who again came to me because she would get irritated and feel depressed. Also, another sign was cutting her hands. This I've seen in almost 5 cases with 5 girls who would show signs of cutting their hands. And her story was that when she was at home, unsupervised, her older brother and she experimented with sex. And she was 6 years old, her older brother was 15. And this went on for a while till they were discovered, they were reprimanded, and that was it. But this girl, at the age of 19, feelings such as low self-esteem, depression would come up. Case number 3 was of a girl whose father was an alcoholic. He was also a kind of a sadist rapist who would rape her, and she could not tell anybody. Nobody would pay attention, nobody would believe that this would happen. And even if they believed it happened, they rubbished it. The girls, when, the thing is, many of them in their disclosures, they speak about the feeling of guilt, huge amount of guilt that they go through because they feel that they were not able to do anything, they didn't stop it from happening. And these are the victims of most pedophile relationships also sometimes feel the same, but incest, it is someone they know. And so it becomes very difficult for them to kind of relate this anger towards that person. And even if they feel angry, people around them do not accept this anger. Like all the girls that I have spoken to or who I've been counseling, they speak about that their mothers knew about it, but they did not validate it. They would be vigilant, but they did not do anything else about it. And this anger that they did not do anything else about it was directing inside of them. Another thing that happens in incest relationship is because sometimes the person who actually has a sexual contact with the victim is someone the victim likes or someone the victim looks up to. And this age group, between 6 to 10 years, the ability to think abstractly of what is right and wrong sometimes is very fuzzy. And often if it's a physical intimacy, the child might even enjoy it. And that is why there is so much of anger and suicidal tendencies as an older person, because then the brain develops for reasoning to take place. And so the anger comes out then. This kind of relationship between a relative in the family and the victim is more difficult to able to handle is because the whole family that is involved, the cultural relevance of especially male figures in our society, the fact that fathers are considered or husbands are considered to be Pati Parmeshwar, like almost godlike. That idea which is there, often it's very difficult for the woman or the mother to be able to go against her daughter to assert herself. And these issues come up especially in incestuous relationship. So the victim gets caught between her feelings, what she's feeling, her anger, and what can be done. And so all they need is sometimes a validation that this has happened to me, accept it. Ironically, none of the victims look at even thinking of punishing the perpetrator, because for them, the thought in their mind of punishing such a person is not there. It's just anger that it has happened to them. But when it comes to reporting or punishing, they will not be part of the kind of act. They will say, I want my mother to know about it and say that this has happened. But they would not say, if you have to complain to the police station, they will not want to do this. In fact, they will not want to complain against the father or the brother at the police station. Especially in cases which are non-abusive. Incest doesn't have to be physically abusive. Incest also happens when it is not physically abusive. And that kind of relationship is more damaging, because the fact is you're trusting someone who is an older person who you otherwise trust, you are learning to mistrust. That mistrust factor is more damaging than actually, if it was a physical relationship, the anger would be directed directly. So sometimes when it is not physically aggressive, the relationship, the feelings are so within that it is, non-generalized anxiety that is coming out. Given this, what do we do in such a situation? How does the law work towards incest? How would you report a father? Because we have to have laws that are realistic. You cannot have laws which, how would for example, another case of a girl whose father was abusing her, there was so much of anger and vehemence when she got out of the house. But the fact that when it came to report and her father cried a few tears in front of her, she was withdrawing the complaint. So what do we do? I think there are two things. One is the way the law looks at it, and the second is also what as a society, because that's where I would comment on. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that incest relationships take place. And I think that is acknowledging this issue, allowing children to feel comfortable and build confidence in them to, say that these things can happen. I think this type of awareness is very important, because the moment you talk about incest, we always talk about, or pedophiles, it's always somebody else from the outside. We very rarely think that it could be somebody from the inside, but most often it is somebody from the inside, and this does not get reported. If the child has to be removed from the family, where does the child go? How does it work? Does this man who is a pedophile and an incest, what type of punishment would he deserve? And so where is the child safe? I think that is something that we need to look at as well.
You have very clearly brought out the fact that incest is a most horrific crime, not only, in terms with regard to the sexual nature of what happens, but also the power dynamic that is involved, and where people who are in a position of love, in a position of trust, misuse this in order to use children for their own kind of sexual needs. Also, how this can result in very serious psychological trauma, and a lot of incidents of deliberate self-harm, where this deep emotional pain, which is unbearable, is then converted into a physical pain. So when I cut myself, at least I can see the blood, I can see the injury, and that is something I can deal with, rather than this emotional pain which I just can't get a grip of. And lastly, the shame and the secrecy, which makes it all the more complicated, because very often the family itself does not want to acknowledge this. So the victim is a double victim. Not only have they suffered the abuse, but they do not get the support that they need after talking about it. Before I open the discussion to the full house, I'd just like to touch upon very briefly the situation of children with special needs, because it hasn't been covered in the previous discussions, and I think it is an important aspect. In a dangerous world, I think for the child with special needs, the world is an even scarier place. And we have the statistics to show for it, which say that children with developmental disabilities are 2 or 3 times at higher risk to suffer sexual abuse. And we don't have any statistics for India, but from the US, it is said that for girls, 70 to 80% of them, 70 to 80% of girls with developmental disabilities had been raped by the age of 18. For boys, it is 40 to 70%. Okay, so we have a huge problem here, which again is not spoken about. And the reason why sexual abuse is so common with children with developmental disabilities is because they are at increased risk, one, by the nature of their disability. So they may not be able to know what is happening to them. They may not be able to report what is happening to them because of lack of language ability. And also they are not able to stop it. If you teach children about prevention, a child who has typical development, then many times they are able to stop the abuse from continuing. But this does not happen quite often for a child with a disability. Also, because of the nature of their disability, they may be in a position of care where they have to be bathed or they have to be taken to the toilet, and therefore they are again at more risk for sexual abuse. Now, what can we do about this? And I think we have to focus on prevention to keep our children safe, because that is the most important step. Once the child is abused, we have seen it is such a complicated process and it is such a long drawn out process which very often doesn't result in kind of an effective response. So how can we prevent? And the key word here is education. And education has to start with parents and teachers. Even before we talk to children, the people who care for children, which are mostly the parents and the teachers, have to be educated. There are very, very well-defined ways to do this. There was a discussion in the morning of how to do it. Yes, it's not easy, but neither is it impossible. And since we are dealing with children, we have to keep it simple. How do we keep it simple? Well, there are a few messages that we need to give children. So first of all, who is going to do this? I think professionals, when I say professionals, I don't mean doctors, it can be the teachers themselves, but there are people who have been trained. Okay, so I think it's important that professionals are involved, but parents cannot relinquish their responsibility because professionals can give information. Only parents can give values. And the value is different in each and every house. So, for example, if I was talking about homosexuality or about masturbation as a professional, the family value will be different. So when I first talk to parents and train parents and give them the reassurance that they can give the child their own value, you will see the relaxation in the parents' face. Because quite often, this fear that Andina spoke about, that if we talk to children about sexuality, they want to go out and have sex. Okay, this is a very real fear in parents' minds. So how do we help them overcome this fear is by reassuring them that we are going to give information, but they have to give the family value. 2, what do we talk about? It differs depending on the age group of the child. So right from, sexuality education starts from birth. Because from the way that the child is held and cared for and loved, okay, the way the child is disciplined, okay, all this tells the child who they are and how they are respected in this world. So it's not just talking about sexual intercourse and how babies are made and how babies are born. It starts right from very, very early in teaching them about the names of their body parts. And here again we have the issue of language, which was again spoken about in the morning. What words do we use? And there are 3 types of language. There is the technical language or the scientific language. There is the home language. And there is the street language. So for example, if I was talking about, say, the penis, the scientific word would be penis. The home word, maybe nunu, pipi, pupu, pipi, each home again has a different word. And then there would be the street language, which would be offensive and rude like cock. Okay, but the thing is, I believe, we must teach children the scientific and technical terms. Why? So that we have a universal way to address this. So names of body parts, personal hygiene, how to keep yourself safe. Again, very, very simple. You know that one, you have a body, okay, which is your most precious possession. So how will you look after something that was very precious to you? Okay, how will you take care of it? That is how you will look after your body. Okay, and your body belongs to you. Nobody has a right to touch your body or ask you to touch their body, okay, without your permission. And what if this happens? 3 things. Say no, go away from that place and go and tell somebody. So simple messages like this can be told to children to teach them about how to keep themselves safe. Of course, as they grow older, then we have to tell them more about, sexuality. We have to tell them when they're teenagers about contraception, about making proper choices, and so on. So there are many even lesson plans and approaches which are used, and I think many schools in Goa have already started doing this. So I think the message that I want to give is that sexuality education can be done. It has to be both with parents and teachers before we go to the children, and all have to work together. There are simple ways in which we can teach children. And if we are uncomfortable about the word sexuality, we can call it body science, because that is basically what the children are learning about their own bodies, how their bodies work, how to keep their bodies safe, and so on. Yeah, I'd like to now open the floor for discussions, and if there are any questions that the audience would like to ask. I think we have about 10 minutes. Can somebody tell me what the time? 10 minutes is okay? Yeah. For questions? Oh, so 10 minutes. Anybody?
What I understand from the new law that has come, protection of sexual offences against children, in that there is a provision for mandatory reporting for anyone who comes to know about the likelihood of any abuse taking place. So I wanted to know from Aldina, like, what you feel about this in the context of incest cases. Do you think that it would be, helpful for the children, or do you fear what this is going to mean?
You know what, even if it is reported, my fear is that will the family and the victim herself go through it, go against the perpetrator, that is the father or the brother. That likelihood is, I feel, is minimal, because I have seen that happening, where if somebody else takes action against saying that this is reported, even the law, I mean the people who you report to will not accept the fact. They will find it, they will not take it very, there's a big gap between what is happening and what is the reality. So even if this law is there, my fear, it's a very good thing that somebody else can report it, but whether it will go to its end, whether the person will be empowered enough to be able to take on the whole case is...
But as a counsellor, would you feel comfortable reporting?
As a counsellor, do anything about it. I mean, these cases should come out in the open.
I can just add to what Alina says. When a child tells, again, the messages that have to be given is, first, you were right to tell. You were smart to tell. Do tell the child, you asked for it, or it's my way of building their self-confidence for them to come out with the abuse and tell them that you have a right to be protected.
In the last session, you mentioned that say you have a primary school, and when the children say go from 4th to 5th, it would be welcome to have a kind of this. But I wanted to just give a response at that time to you that we should not wait till the 4th standard for getting this response. It should be much earlier. I don't know whether...
Absolutely. I said preschool. Yes.
My question is to Dr. Nandita. What kind of prevention methods, when we're talking about differently able children, what kind of prevention method would you suggest or would you take for the child who's been abused at home regularly and is not aware about it, and when you make the parents aware about it and they don't want to take it, they don't want to accept the fact. So what prevention method would you suggest for such a case?
I would try and identify at least one family member who would be able to keep the child safe. If the child themselves was incapable of doing that, okay? To get the child out of that situation. Because if it's within the home and it's either the mother or the father, then the child is continuously at risk. And I would call the person actually that agreed to come, okay, and tell them that we know, so you have to stop. And now if it's mandatory reporting, I would probably, with the kind of confidence of the family, report it. Because the secrecy is not good for anybody, and that's the point. We must tell children to keep themselves safe, that secrets with anything to do with their safety, that should never be kept a secret, because children have this thing about, I was told a secret and I was told to keep it a secret. So anything to do with safety should never be kept secret.
I mean, other than the family setting,
yeah.
You cannot do anything inside. I mean, it's not working out. Then other than the family setting, what else is the option that a professional can do, to help the child?
Yeah. Well, the main first thing is to get the child into a position where they're safe. So if there wasn't any other family member, or say from the extended family, who could take charge, the next would be Apna, which we know that is not the best situation. So is there somebody in the neighborhood, is there a home, like a children's institution, where the child can be taken? And now we have some guidelines on foster care, right? Because the abuse has to stop. That is the first thing. And if the child is able to protect themselves to some extent, at least teach the child to start screaming. If they are able to kick, basically protection, personal protection. But it would depend on like the abilities of the child. Yes, okay.
I just want to draw your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting and energizing debate, and I'm sure everybody is ready for lunch. So I thank my speakers over here who did an excellent job, and thanks to the audience for your patient hearing. Now please go and raise your blood sugar.